Oakland socialists interviewed Nigerian journalist Phillip Obaji Jr. He is described by the International Center for Journalists as, quote, the foremost journalist reporting for international audiences on massacres, rape, torture, and other abuses at the hands of Russian paramilitaries in Central and West Africa. Phillip Obaji has traveled at considerable risk to himself. He has also reported on human trafficking from Nigeria, such as in this article, whose link I'll post when we publish this interview. So with that, we go to the interview, and I apologize for the fact that the first minute or so of this interview was not recorded.
And it is not strange to find the Nigerian government, taking over civil society offices and targeting, the organized labor. So we have become so accustomed to things like this.
Right. And I know that a lot of your reporting has been about other countries in in Africa.
Yeah.
And as I read in the introduction, you've done a lot of reporting on the role of Russian forces in Africa. And I think that's particularly important here in the United States because a lot of the left somehow sees Russia as kind of like a liberating force in Africa. So,
well, that's
can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, that's how the Russians see themselves, as a liberating force in Africa. Well, they have been involved, that's talking about the Russian Federation, they have been involved in a number of countries in Africa. And their involvement is in the form of having military presence, courtesy of Russian paramilitaries from the Wagner Group or from the BA Brigade. I mean, Russia had paramilitaries in countries like Sudan, in Libya, in Mozambique, and in the Central African Republic, where they're still active, and in Mali, where they're still active. Well, in the last couple of years, in fact, since 2018, Russia has maintained a strong presence in the Central African Republic, where over 1,000 Russian paramilitaries who were drawn from the Wagner Group have been involved in efforts by the Central African government to fight against rebels that are scattered across the country. Well, the Russians are also involved in Mali, where Wagner paramilitaries have been working with Malian soldiers to fight against jihadists in the north and against Tuareg separatists who are seeking independence for a region in northern Mali, which they refer to as Azawad. So, there's a little Russian presence in Burkina Faso, where the military junta has become very close to Russia in terms of how they cooperate militarily and economically. And there is some Russian presence in Niger, where the military is also in control of power.
So you talked about being involved in Russia being involved in like opposition to some terrorist groups, but also I've heard you report that it's far more than that. Also, that there's a whole different side. There's a whole different side to Russian involvement in, like for instance, Central African Republic and other countries.
That's correct, John. And I'm going to explain how the Russians got involved in the Central African Republic in the first place. Now, the country descended into a civil war in 2013 when Christian militias and Muslim rebels fought against each other to gain control of the country. Somehow, the Central African Republic was able to hold elections in 2016. And mind you, after it fell into the civil war in 2013, the UN imposed an arms embargo on the country, meaning they could not buy or sell or do any armed business in the country. So when President Francine Ashaje Touadera took office in 2016, he inherited a country that was almost entirely in the control of these militiamen. In fact, only the capital, Bangui, was under government control. And it was going to be only a matter of time before these militiamen overrode the capital. So once he took office, he had to turn to Russia for help in two ways. First, to get the UN Security Council to lift the arms embargo. Then, secondly, he wanted Russian soldiers to come into the country to do two things. One, to train the local forces to be able to fight against these militiamen, and two, to also provide security for the president and for some very key government establishments. Now, Vladimir Putin agreed to this request, but on the condition that the Russian government through the Wagner Group will be able to have access to the Central African Republic's vast gold and diamond resources. The problem was the more than 100 gold mines in the country when areas that were held by these militiamen. None of these gold and diamond mines were located in Bangui, where the government had control. So for the Russians to be able to do anything meaningful in these areas, they needed to fight against these armed militiamen. So once they came into the country in 2018, once the Wagner Group arrived in the country in 2018, they began finding ways to take control of these gold and diamond mines. And so it was always a battle with these militiamen. And in many instances, the Russians made no distinction between civilians and armed men. So when they go into a mining community, they open fire at the populace, slaughter a lot of people, torture those who they feel are accomplices to these militiamen. So that's why we've seen numerous incidents of massacres, torture, rape, and other forms of human rights abuses. It's the same thing that we've seen in Mali, where the Russians, in its attempt to fight against Islamist jihadists, have labeled communities where the jihadists operate as, complete communities where you have that's completely inhabited by terrorists. So when they invade a community, they punish the local population because they feel that they are accomplices in this whole conflict here.
And is there any relationship between Russia and Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso?
Of course. Now, I reported some years ago when the coup first took place in 2020, that the officers who were behind that coup had informed the then president that it was to the interest of his administration if they invited the Russians to do business or to help fight against jihadists. But once the president rejected the offer a month after, he was toppled. But the same military officers who toppled the civilian president were also toppled by other junior officers. But these junior officers too have created an alliance with Russia, and the Russians have had to send over 300 members of the Beer Brigade, which is another private military company, to the country. The Beer Brigade is a Russian PMC. Now, the Russians somehow have been targeting democracies in Africa, in West Africa in particular. And there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of disinformation targeting democracy, and the aim is to somehow make democracy unpopular. Now, they have somehow succeeded to a reasonable extent in creating an image out of Traore, portraying him as the liberator, as the messiah for Burkina Faso, and trying to tell other African nations that they could actually perform. African leaders can perform in the same way that Traore is performing. But this is all Russian propaganda and it's all Russian disinformation. If you go to Burkina Faso, where I've been to in recent months, you will not see anything that depicts what the Russians have portrayed Traore as. The country is still in a very sorry state. Poverty levels are rising, insecurity is still very high. But the Russians have, in many ways, succeeded in creating an image out of Traore, painting him as, a figure that Africa needs.
When he first took power through the coup, was there a certain amount of popular support for him initially?
Well, for some reason, the military juntas in Africa are gaining much support from many of the citizens, and that is because, to start with, a lot of times African leaders or leaders in some parts of Africa have really failed to guarantee security, to turn around their countries economically. And I'm talking about the democratically elected leaders. And it's even worse in countries in the Sahel that have experienced years of Islamist insurgency and local conflicts. So it's often believed that politics and politicians have been behind some of these conflicts. So when you have a military coup with young officers seizing power and promising heaven and earth, you're always going to find people who will support this. And the fact that they're coming up with ideas that somehow seem to be anti-Western, which in some ways align with the disinformation that is growing across the region, that tells people that the West is the big problem to Africa, and that France in particular has been the major problem for the Sahelian countries. So in this kind of situation, you're always going to find massive support for military dictators.
It seems to me that part of it is almost like a lack of self-confidence that we can solve our problems, and looking for somebody to solve the problems for us. In this case, a military dictator.
You're correct, John. And there are some people who are asking the question as to whether democracy works for Africa. And because, like I said, we've seen decades after independence of lack of reasonable growth in many African countries. So it becomes very easy for military rule to sell, especially in this era of social media and disinformation that is growing in the internet and particularly on social media. So it's easy to sell a narrative. And where African leaders have failed is the fact that they have done very little to fight disinformation. And I sometimes think that even Europe, should be able to step in, because much of Russia's disinformation is targeting Europe and targeting the West, because they're trying to find new friends in Africa and trying to make Africans feel that the biggest problem to Africa is not Africans, it's not Africa itself, but it's the fact that the West is trying to interfere in the affairs of African nations. So this is the kind of disinformation that Russia feeds on, and it's kind of a disinformation that's actually gaining traction, across the continent.
Of course, there's a whole horrific history of Britain, France, and also the United States in its own way of colonizing and just devastating African societies. And during the wars of liberation there, the Soviet Union played a somewhat different role. And so I'm wondering how much of that like collective memory of that history, how much that plays into maybe a certain support, like, well, Russia helped free us before and they're doing it again, or something like that.
Well, it is true that Africa suffered a lot during the colonial era, but it also gains during that era. But I always say that we're in the 21st century and actions should be different. We're not in the 19th century or the 20th century. Now, we need to be embracing a new way of partnership and no, not brutality. For what was done in the 1950s, in the 19th century, the 18th century, that was in the past. Going forward, we should not be talking about new colonialism in Africa. We should be talking about development, in various ways. Now, in terms of how history is shaping things, the problem now is the history is a little bit tweaked. And the young people who are the vast majority of users of social media and the internet really are not getting the right history. Now, it has been flooded across the internet that during the apartheid in South Africa, you know, the Soviet Union played the biggest role in terms of support for the ANC or in terms of campaign against apartheid. But there are lots of people who are in argument to that. I mean, I meet a lot of South Africans who tell me that it was the Ukrainian section of the USSR that really showed that much support for anti-apartheid apartheid in South Africa. And that is history that I will leave for the historians. But the way it has been portrayed to Africans feels like uh, the West were completely terrible. And I always say that the West really has its own flaws. I think that France did not really do well in the more than a decade or close to a decade of its involvement in the Sahel, in Mali, and in Burkina Faso. I mean, the French deployed troops to that region, and we didn't see any results in terms of uh, the defeat of jihadist groups and terrorism in the region. So the French also had its problems in Central Africa under the UN mission, but the Russians have not been any better.
I'm sorry, say that
And
again. The Russians what?
the Russians have not been any better, for Africa, because since the Wagner group got involved in Mali, we haven't seen much gains in terms of how jihadist groups have fared. I mean, in terms of how they have been defeated. No, they have not been defeated. So what we see is a growth in conflict, a growth in violence, and we're seeing the Russians explore and exploit the resources of the Central African Republic. So if the West didn't do well, then Africa is not getting any better from Russia.
Um, are there some other? Can you talk about some of the other countries in Africa where you've focused attention and have done reporting on recently?
Well, I have put a lot of attention on the Central African Republic and on Mali, but recently I've started to look at disinformation from Russia that's targeting the entire West Africa. One of the countries where disinformation is growing is Niger, which is a very important country for migrants who are seeking to travel to Europe through the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea. And what I'm witnessing is a growth in the people smuggling operations in the country. Now, a city called Agadez is a city in the central part of Niger, is an important hub for people smuggling. So the vast majority of sub-Saharan Africans who are seeking to travel to Europe usually converge in Agadez. So what happens is that when a people smuggler or when a migrant intends to travel to Europe, he or she first travels to Agadez and then finds a smuggler who makes sure that he or she is able to get on the vehicle that transports he or she across the desert to Libya, and then from there on boats to Italy or Greece. The issue is this: because there are thousands of people hoping to travel. So usually migrants spend weeks waiting for their chance to get on a vehicle. And when they wait for weeks, they are paying monies to landlords, they are staying in hotels or brothels or whatever it is. And that helps in boosting, the economy of Agadez and of Niger. Now, the EU was concerned about this massive movement of people from Africa, from Agadez, on all the way to Italy or Greece. So what they did was that they funded the the Nigerian security forces, and even pushed the Nigerian government to be able to get the parliament to pass a law that criminalized people smuggling. That law was passed in 2015. But 2 years ago, after the military took power in Niger, one of its first acts was to abolish that law, which effectively decriminalized people smuggling. So what we're seeing right now is that the people smuggling trade has returned to Agadez and it's booming. But that's not all. As we speak, there are people on the streets who are encouraging local Nigerians to travel to Europe. And even in one of my last recent visits to Niger, I listened on a local radio station how um, commentators, pro-Russian commentators, were encouraging Nigerians to travel to Europe, claiming that there are vast opportunities for people to excel in Europe. So that's its way of one boosting the business of migration of people smuggling in Agadez, but also it forms part of the Russian agenda to flood Europe with migrants or to create a migrants crisis on Europe's borders. So that's part of the Russian agenda. So that's what I'm investigating. And also, I'm seeing that there's a growth in Russian trolling on social media. There are many Russian trolls that are creeping up. And much of these trolls are accounts that are targeting democracy in Europe. Recently, the Netherlands had its elections and we had massive disinformation from Russian trolls. And many of these trolls are actually stationed in Africa, in countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and what have you. Yeah.
I understand that they're somewhat influential in South Africa also.
Oh, yes. I mean, even the ANC, which is the ruling party in South Africa, somehow have been very empathetic or sympathetic towards Russia. And you have a lot of Russian friends, in politics. But again, it goes back down to history where many South Africans feel that um, the Russians may have or did play an important role during apartheid. But also, it's the economic drive because South Africa is part of the BRICS alliance, the BRICS economic alliance, and it's always favorable to them if they continue to do business with Russia. And you see the friction currently between the South African government and the Trump administration. So that also is a loophole that the Russians have seized. Yeah.
So, I have to say that it seems to me that the so-called West, which, when we say West, we're talking about, well, we should ask ourselves, west of where?
That's a very good question. Yeah.
In some parts of the world, it would be the east of someplace.
Yeah.
So, but in any case, like the United States and Western Europe, that because they are more powerful economically, that they don't have to invade with troops. They can just invade with money, with finances. And so it seems to me that that's part of the equation that we should not forget about.
Yes, I agree. But in what the West has done and what the West is doing, and I'm not a defender of the West. I still always argue against some of their policies and their interests, not just here, but also in third world countries across the globe. And but they are very smart in the way that they operate. And sometimes it's very difficult to actually hold them to account for some of the deeds that they do. But I think the Russians are much more direct, and which makes it very difficult to investigate. Also, which makes it even a lot easier to investigate for us who are journalists in that field in the field of investigation. And also because you have Russian troops on the ground, and it's very clear what they're doing, committing human rights abuses and what have you. Then it makes it easy for you to point fingers at Russia. Now, what Western nations have done in Africa that looks ill, why they succeed, especially in recent years, is the fact that African governments have embraced this and are willing to do their bidding. And the easy way for us, some of us will hold the government to account, is that we are seeing the people who are the ones doing this. We cannot see the West. We can see the decisions that the local governments are making. And oftentimes they're influenced, but it's very difficult to say, okay, well, this is how the influence has happened. This is where the influence is coming from. But we put our thinking cap, and then we have realized that yes, there's always an external influence, but it's very difficult to come up with evidence because the actions taken by the local government, by the state. Here, it's very, very easy to identify what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's easier to see the troops than the finances.
Yeah, correct.
So,
That's correct.
yeah. No, go ahead. You were going to say something more further?
Yeah, it's easy to see the troops like we look at what was seen in Central African Republic, where communities have been invaded by foreign actors. In this case, Russia. We're seeing people being held hostage. We're listening to stories of young girls who have narrated how they were raped and abused. We're seeing incidents of massacres. We're seeing how young people are tortured. We're seeing how women are killed and disemboweled, the intestines pulled out of them. So these are the kind of situations that really make a lot of people, including me, very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty horrific. I have to say, speaking to you, and being in Nigeria in particular, I was just reading a little while ago, Things Fall Apart by the author from your country, Chinua Achebe. And I have to tell you, about halfway through it, I had to stop reading it because it was like reading this tragedy, that you knew was going to come, about how the society that the people themselves had developed, how things fell apart. That whole society was just ripped apart. And it seems to me that you're describing something similar here again.
I think it's even worse. Chinua Achebe explained, the white man's, influence and impact in Africa at the time during the colonial era, and how in some ways we had to really change culturally to be able to accommodate the colonial masters and what have you. But then we didn't see a situation. I mean, there were times when the British fought with the locals during the colonial era, but I didn't even. Much of what I know about is about what happened during the colonial era, where what I read in books. But again, we're in the 21st century, and what we're seeing is another version of what some African nations experienced during the slave era, the slave trade era, and also during the colonial era. So it shouldn't be happening in the 21st century. That's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, it sure shouldn't. Yeah. So, as this is, speaking from Oakland socialist, I have a socialist perspective. And just in conclusion, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, that honestly, from hundreds of years ago, that it seems to me, capitalism has offered nothing but a nightmare to the people of Africa. And I'd like to, get your thoughts on that.
Well, you are correct, but do we blame capitalism or do we blame corruption? So that's the thing. So whether we're socialist or capitalist, it all depends on exactly what happens to what decisions are taken at the top. And I still think, that capitalism can work and can be useful for Africa if we have systems itself that are working, and if people in positions really want the system to work. So it is about a system failure, more or less, than about what way of life that we choose. So the system has failed, the institutions have failed. So that's why it feels like capitalism really hasn't worked. So I mean, there are many areas in Africa where we've seen a blend of socialism and capitalism. But the truth is, things are not working, not because of what way of life we've chosen, or what way of development we've chosen, but simply because, we have corruption growing so massively in many areas.
Well, I was going to conclude on that note, but I have to say, when you talk about corruption, the United States is probably the home of corruption at this point, with Trump in office. I mean, we've had quote corruption in this country for for centuries, but Trump beats them all, you know, and he does it just out in the open. And so I have to wonder what we call corruption, if it's not just simply the expression of the very values of capitalism, which are enrich yourself. So if you're supposed to enrich yourself, why shouldn't somebody, when they get in office, do the same thing?
Yeah, but you see, in the US and in Europe, systems have been placed. You have systems that have been in place for centuries, and people work with the system, and the system works. Now in Africa, you have, a collapse, or you don't even have systems in place in the first place. For example, the healthcare has been working. You look at the issues around the economy. You look at issues about respects. The transport systems work, the health systems work, the educational systems work, and these systems have been put in place for centuries. And whoever migrates from Africa, from Asia to Europe or the US, when they get there, they fall in line with the system. Like, how to behave, how to follow the rules, how to. But we haven't seen much of those systems put in place right here in many parts of Africa. So it makes it very difficult. So even if you have a Trump in office and his policies are not going well with the people haven't lost their sense of reasoning. People have not decided to break traffic rules, the left, right, center. People have not decided to disrespect the the institutions that really have made America a great country. So that's the difference, yeah, between what happens there and what happens here.
You know, poverty and even chaos are relative,
Mm-hmm.
both relative to another part of the world and also what you expect, you know. And so most people in the United States would say, well, no, the healthcare system is not working here. Or as some people have said, the American healthcare system, America has a healthcare system, it's don't get sick. And transportation. So the other point is that a lot of people would argue that part of the reason that things work better, let's say in Europe or the United States, is because of the tremendous wealth that it stole from Africa, Asia, and Latin America for 100 years or more. And that gave it kind of a foundation.
That's a good point. But the wealth that the US has is not what has told Americans to obey traffic rules, or it's not America's wealth that taught Americans how, to ensure that when you're in office, money is meant for healthcare or for education or for social security be used at least to a reasonable extent for what it is made for. It is not the monies that were stolen that told Americans that where there are resources in the US, people should find ways of exploring these resources for the good of the American people. Now, what we see here is the fact that when you find a country in Africa that has rich resources, whether it's gold, whether it's oil, whether it's diamonds, whatever it is, you always find conflict in that area, warring factors, warring factions, everywhere. Now, when someone is given the privilege of serving in high office, I mean, this doesn't happen everywhere, but in many places, when someone has the privilege of serving in high office, the first thing he or she thinks about is how to amass for his or herself. It is not the monies that stole many years ago that has made people to be self-conscious. You get it is the fact that people came together to agree or to decide that they must develop the environment, they must stand for each other, and they must make where they live very great. So I still think that culturally we have a big problem in Africa where we need to sit down, tell ourselves it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what language you speak, it doesn't matter, which God you pray to. We must find a way to agree on something that we must develop our communities. Yeah.
So, I mean, here, it's not just in the United States, but actually we see throughout Europe and beyond how the system really works through the name of one single person, Epstein.
Yeah.
And we see that I mean, the entire ruling class from Denmark and Sweden, Great Britain, Israel, and of course the United States have been involved in human trafficking, basically rape of young girls, all this, and also combined with that has been the sale of state secrets. So, I mean, that's how the system works here.
Well, again, we're talking about a selected few, and I don't believe that, the fact that the Epstein files have somehow implicated massive amounts of politicians. That doesn't represent the vast majority of who Americans are or who Europeans are, or who even Africans are, if there are any Africans on the Epstein files. But it is very unfortunate that some people will really should be protecting values that are critical to life, will be involved in such a scheme, and it's really, really sad. Yeah.
But I mean, it's not just the politicians. Bill Gates was involved. God knows who.
Of course, very influential people in the society, not just those in government or those in politics, but there were also people in business, people in the arts, and very influential people everywhere. So, but it's really sad that that which now feels like an organized crime was even allowed, was even allowed to take place in the first place. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Has the whole Epstein scandal been, is that covered in the press in Africa at all?
Well, on social media, well, it's massive, and some particular, and even the Russians too are even involved in spreading, in amplifying this, and even spreading disinformation regarding this. I've also been one of the few journalists who've been targeted, by some Russian trolls who claimed that I provided cover for a man called Mark Epstein, who they claim is a brother to Jeffrey Epstein. And they claimed that the Mark was involved in trafficking African girls, from Africa. And some journalists, including me, as they claim, provided cover, for these operations, which is complete nonsense, So I don't even know who Mark Epstein is. And I never even knew who Jeffrey Epstein was, until, this whole scandal, came to the open. Yeah.
So, with that, do you have any final words, Philip, for listeners or people that are watching this video here in the United States and elsewhere? What final message would you like to get across?
Well, I want people to just know that in Africa we're facing a big problem. First of all, with Russian disinformation, and some of what people may understand about African democracy and what happens in Africa may be distorted because we have massive disinformation. And I hate to always sound like a beggar, but I think at this point I can ask that Europe, the US will need to also join hands with African nations to fight disinformation. Yeah.
Okay. With that, we thank Phillip Obaji for his time and for the important work that he is doing in Africa.